If you sat Dexter Morgan down in a therapist's office, the first thing you'd notice is how normal he looks. Clean-cut, well-dressed, polite. He'd shake your hand with just the right amount of pressure, make eye contact for exactly the right duration, and settle into the chair like a man who has rehearsed every human interaction he's ever had. Because he has. Dexter Morgan is a blood spatter analyst for the Miami Metro Police Department. He brings donuts to work. He dates a single mother. He takes his sister's calls. He goes to barbecues and makes small talk and smiles when people expect him to smile. And after everyone goes home, he wraps his victims in plastic sheeting, cuts them into pieces, and drops the parts into the ocean from the deck of his fishing boat, The Slice of Life. The show that bears his name ran for 8 seasons. It spawned a sequel in New Blood, a prequel in Original Sin, and a resurrection that confirmed what the story always seemed to be building toward, that Dexter Morgan is a man who cannot die because the darkness inside him will not let him stay dead. For 12 episodes, or 96, or however many you want to count, the show told us exactly what Dexter was. A psychopath, a monster wrapped in human skin, a predator who learned to mimic the appearance of a person the way a virus learns to mimic a healthy cell, so that it can keep feeding without being detected. But what if the show was wrong about its own character? Because if you actually sit down with a psychologist, not a television writer, not a fictional psychiatrist with her own agenda, but an actual clinician trained in trauma and personality disorders, the picture that emerges is completely different. A psychologist evaluating Dexter would see something that 8 seasons of television consistently showed us but never quite acknowledged. Dexter Morgan is not a psychopath in the classical constitutional sense. He is a profoundly traumatized human being whose capacity for emotion was not absent from birth. It was severed deliberately and systematically, first by a shipping container full of blood, and then by a well-meaning father who taught his son that he was a monster instead of getting him help. Understanding Dexter through actual clinical frameworks doesn't just change how you interpret the character, it changes everything. It changes the meaning of Harry's code. It changes the significance of every relationship Dexter ever formed. It changes the tragedy of Deborah Morgan's destruction and Harrison's inheritance and the entire question of whether any of it had to happen the way it did. That's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to take Dexter Morgan apart, not with plastic wrap and a bone saw, but with the diagnostic and statistical manual and 3 decades of research on childhood trauma and dissociation. And what we find, I think, is going to be far more disturbing than anything the show ever put on screen. Because a monster is simple. A monster you can lock away or put down or manage with a code. But a wounded child who was failed by every person who was supposed to protect him, that's complicated. And that's what Dexter actually is. So settle in, get comfortable. And let's talk about what's really wrong with Dexter Morgan. If you're enjoying this and you want to hear the whole thing, subscribe. We're going to be here for a while. If Dexter Morgan walked into a clinical setting for a genuine psychological evaluation, the initial impression would be fascinating and deeply misleading at the same time. The clinician would observe a man in his mid-30s, well-groomed, physically fit, calm to the point of seeming sedated. He would answer questions precisely, perhaps too precisely. There would be no visible emotional distress, no fidgeting, no avoidance, no defensive body language. He would present as cooperative, even pleasant, and the clinician would write down words like guarded and affect restricted and hypervigilant to social cues, without quite being able to explain why this pleasant, cooperative man was making the hair on the back of their neck stand up. Because there's something wrong with Dexter that you can feel before you can name it. He is performing normalcy the way an actor performs a role. And when you've been in clinical practice long enough, you can hear the slight delay between the question and the response, the half second where his brain is calculating the correct reaction before producing it. That delay is the tell. Genuine emotional responses are automatic. Calculated ones have a lag. The show calls this psychopathy. Dexter himself believes it's psychopathy. I fake all human interactions, he tells us in his internal monologue from the very first episode. He treats his social performance as evidence that he lacks the underlying emotional hardware that makes those interactions genuine for everyone else. He's pretending to be human, and the pretense itself proves he isn't one. But here's where a careful clinician would start to disagree with Dexter's self-assessment. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, doesn't actually include psychopathy as a formal diagnosis. What it includes is antisocial personality disorder, which overlaps substantially but not completely with what researchers call psychopathy. If you run Dexter through the diagnostic criteria for ASPD, he qualifies without much debate. Repeated violation of the law, deceitfulness, impulsivity in certain contexts, irritability, reckless disregard for the safety of others, lack of remorse, evidence of conduct disorder before age 15, including killing animals as a child, which Harry discovered and which set the entire code in motion. He checks the boxes. And if you go further, if you apply the psychopathy checklist revised, the PCLR developed by Robert Hare, which is the gold standard instrument for measuring psychopathic traits in forensic populations, Dexter scores high there too. Academic analyses of his character have placed him at roughly 19 out of 20 on the PCLR's factor model. Glib charm, grandiose self-image, need for stimulation, pathological lying, manipulativeness, shallow affect, callousness. On paper, Dexter looks like a textbook case. But this is where it gets interesting. Because for every trait on that checklist that Dexter matches, there is a moment in the show, sometimes many moments, where he demonstrates the exact opposite. And those contradictions are not errors in the writing. They are the whole point. Dexter is supposed to lack empathy. But when Rita Bennett is murdered by the Trinity Killer in the season 4 finale, and Dexter finds her body in a bathtub full of blood with their infant son Harrison sitting on the floor in the aftermath, Dexter does not react like a psychopath. He reacts like a man whose heart has been ripped from his chest. His grief is raw and uncontrollable. He kills a random man in a gas station bathroom in a fit of emotional anguish that has nothing to do with the code and everything to do with pain he cannot contain. Harry's ghost tells him it was the first human thing you've done. That line should bother you, because if Dexter is truly a psychopath, there should be no human things at all. Dexter's supposed to be incapable of genuine attachment. But his bond with his sister Deborah is the most consistent emotional thread in the entire series. He consistently prioritizes her safety above his own. He agonizes over the damage his secret causes her. When she discovers what he is, and her life spirals into PTSD and substance abuse and suicidal ideation, Dexter doesn't observe this with clinical detachment. He feels responsible. He feels guilty. And when Deborah dies in the season 8 finale, Dexter's response is not to move on with the flat affect of a man untroubled by loss. He disconnects her life support, carries her body to his boat, takes her out to sea, and then drives his boat into a hurricane. That is not the behavior of a man who feels nothing. Dexter is supposed to lack remorse, but throughout the series, particularly in the later seasons, he is increasingly troubled by the consequences of his actions. He questions the code. He questions the dark passenger. He genuinely tries, to stop killing and to build a life that doesn't require a body count. These attempts always fail, but the fact that he makes them at all is clinically significant, because people with primary psychopathy don't try to change. They don't feel the need. The absence of distress about their own behavior is one of the defining features of the condition. So what is going on? How can Dexter score 19 out of 20 on a psychopathy checklist and still display emotional responses that are fundamentally incompatible with the diagnosis? A psychologist would recognize what's happening here because they've seen it before. In patients who came through the child welfare system, in veterans with combat trauma, in survivors of prolonged abuse who learned to shut down their emotional responses so completely that even they forgot the emotions were still there. What Dexter presents as is not classical constitutional psychopathy. What Dexter presents as is severe emotional dissociation resulting from catastrophic childhood trauma, overlaid with a lifetime of conditioning that taught him his dissociation was permanent and innate. His emotional responses aren't absent, they're inaccessible. The capacity for connection, for guilt, for grief, for love is not missing from his neurological architecture. It's locked behind a door that was sealed shut when he was 3 years old. And every authority figure in his life, from Harry to Vogel to the show's own narration, has told him that door doesn't exist, that there's nothing behind it, that the emptiness he feels is all there is. The clinical picture that emerges is something closer to complex post-traumatic stress disorder with profound dissociative features. Emotional numbing as a defense mechanism, compulsive ritualistic behavior as trauma reenactment, identity disturbance, a fractured sense of self, organized around an externally imposed narrative that says, "I am a monster." And possibly underneath all of it, a case of secondary psychopathy, which is a crucial clinical distinction because it means that the condition was made, not born, acquired, not innate. And what is acquired can, at least in theory, be treated. That distinction between something you were born with and something that was done to you changes everything about how you understand Dexter Morgan. And it's the distinction the show never makes, because making it would mean admitting that the entire framework the show is built on, the code, the dark passenger, the premise that Dexter is an unchangeable monster who must be managed rather than healed, was wrong from the beginning. If you're still with me, and this is the kind of thing that keeps your brain just engaged enough to drift off to, subscribe, because now we need to go back to where it all started. We need to go back to the shipping container. On October 3rd, in a shipping container at the port of Miami, a woman named Laura Moser was murdered. She wasn't alone. 2 other people were in that container with her, all of them informants who had been feeding information to the police about the drug operations of a man named Hector Estrada. Santos Jimenez, one of Estrada's enforcers, carried out the killings. He used a chainsaw. And while this was happening, while his mother was being dismembered alive in front of him, a 3-year-old boy named Dexter Moser sat on the floor of that container and watched. He wasn't the only child there. His older brother Brian was beside him. Both boys watched. Both boys sat in the blood that pooled around them afterward, and then they waited. For 2 days, those children sat in the remains of their mother's murder. 2 full days in the dark, in the heat of a Miami shipping container surrounded by blood that was slowly congealing around them, until a police officer named Harry Morgan, the same officer who had been running Laura Moser as a confidential informant, opened the container door and found them. To understand what this event did to Dexter's brain, you need to understand a little bit about how a 3-year-old's neurology works. At age 3, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought, impulse control, emotional regulation, and the ability to contextualize experience, is still years away from meaningful development. It won't begin to mature until age 5 or 6, and it won't reach full development until the mid-20s. What is highly active in a 3-year-old is the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, the part that processes fear and danger and stores traumatic memories as visceral, sensory experiences rather than narrative ones. What this means in practical terms is that a 3-year-old who witnesses extreme violence doesn't process it the way an adult would. An adult can, at least in theory, create a narrative around the experience. This happened because of this, and it was terrible, but it's over now, and I am safe. A 3-year-old can't do that. A 3-year-old processes the experience as pure sensory data. The sight of blood, the sound of a chainsaw, the smell of a metal shipping container in Miami heat, the feeling of wetness soaking through pajamas. These sensory imprints don't get filed away as memories in the conventional sense. They get burned into the nervous system at a level below conscious awareness, and they stay there, shaping every emotional response the child will ever have, without the child ever understanding why. This is what psychologists call developmental trauma, and when it occurs at an age this young, in circumstances this extreme, the clinical consequences are profound. The child's attachment system, which is still forming, can be permanently disrupted. The stress response system can become chronically dysregulated, meaning the child's body stays in a state of perpetual fight or flight that it never fully comes down from. And perhaps most significantly for understanding Dexter, the child's capacity for emotional processing can become dissociated from conscious experience, not destroyed, but severed from the child's awareness. The feelings still happen, and the child just can't feel them anymore. There is a specific body of research that is particularly relevant here, and it concerns what psychologists call betrayal trauma. Betrayal trauma theory was developed to explain a specific pattern of traumatic response that occurs when the source of danger is also the source of safety, when the person who's supposed to protect you is the person who caused the harm or is connected to its cause. Laura Moser was killed because she was a confidential informant for Harry Morgan. Harry recruited her. Harry asked her to put herself in danger, and when that danger caught up with her, Harry wasn't there. The person who was supposed to be the bridge between Laura's family and safety was the indirect cause of their destruction. Dexter didn't know this at age 3, of course. He wouldn't learn the details until much later. But the fundamental structure of the betrayal was present from the beginning. Safety and danger woven together so tightly that the developing brain couldn't separate them. Research published in developmental psychology journals has shown that children who experience betrayal trauma, where the danger comes from within the attachment system rather than from an outside threat, are significantly more likely to develop dissociative responses. The theory suggests that the child cannot afford to recognize the betrayal because doing so would mean recognizing that the person they depend on for survival is also the source of danger. So the child's brain solves this impossible problem by disconnecting cognition from emotion. The child knows what happened in some abstract sense, but they can't feel it. The emotional response is stored separately, walled off, inaccessible. This is not psychopathy. This is the brain protecting itself from a truth it cannot survive knowing. And then there's the 2-day detail, because it's not just that Dexter witnessed his mother's murder, it's that he sat in the aftermath for 48 hours. 2 full days in a container with his mother's blood drying around him, with no rescue coming, with no adult present to comfort or explain or hold him. This prolonged exposure would have created a sensory imprint so deep that it would fundamentally alter his relationship with blood for the rest of his life. And look at what blood becomes for Dexter. He becomes a blood spatter analyst. His entire professional identity is organized around the substance that defined the worst moment of his life. He collects blood slides from his victims, tiny glass rectangles, each containing a single drop of blood, which he stores in a hidden wooden box inside his air conditioning unit. He examines them, he catalogs them, he keeps them close. This is not the behavior of a man who feels nothing about blood. This is the behavior of a man who is compulsively returning to the scene of his original wound, trying to master it, trying to control the substance that he couldn't control when he was 3 years old and drowning in it. The clinical term for this is trauma reenactment, and it shows up constantly in survivors of childhood trauma. The person recreates elements of the original traumatic experience, not because they enjoy it, not because they're drawn to violence by some innate predatory instinct, but because the unprocessed trauma keeps pushing its way to the surface, demanding to be addressed. The unconscious mind keeps staging the scene again and again, hoping that this time, maybe, the person will be able to process what happened. But without therapeutic intervention, the reenactment never leads to resolution. It just repeats. And here is where Brian Moser becomes critically important for understanding Dexter's psychology. Brian is the control group. He experienced the same shipping container trauma. He sat in the same blood. He watched the same murder. But where Harry Morgan took Dexter home and raised him and gave him the code, Brian was left behind, discarded, sent through foster homes and institutions, abandoned by the system and by the man who chose to save one brother and forget the other. Brian became the ice truck killer, a genuinely remorseless serial killer with no code, no restraint, no capacity for attachment. He is, in every measurable way, closer to a classical psychopath than Dexter ever was. And the difference between them is not genetic, it's not biological. The difference is what happened after the container. Dexter received intervention. Brian received nothing. The fact that Dexter turned out differently, that he retained some capacity for connection and emotion and restraint, is not evidence that Dexter is a better class of monster. It's evidence that intervention matters, that the post-trauma environment shapes the outcome as much as, or more than, the trauma itself. A psychologist looking at both brothers would see this immediately. Same trauma, different trajectories, different outcomes. The variable that changed between them was not biology, it was what happened next. There's another layer to the shipping container that deserves attention, and it has to do with what psychologists call the window of tolerance. Every person has a window of tolerance for emotional arousal, a range within which they can experience feelings without being overwhelmed. When an experience pushes a person outside that window, the nervous system responds with one of two strategies. It either goes into hyperarousal, which is the fight or flight response, the racing heart, and the flooded adrenaline and the desperate need to act, or it goes into hypoarousal, which is freeze, collapse, dissociation. The body shuts down, the mind disconnects, the person stops feeling, not because they choose to, but because their nervous system has decided that feeling is no longer safe. For a 3-year-old, the window of tolerance is already extremely narrow. A small child doesn't have the neurological resources to regulate intense emotion. They depend on their caregiver to help them process experiences that exceed their capacity. When a child is frightened, they look to their parent. The parent's calm response tells the child's nervous system that the threat is manageable, and the child's arousal comes back down into the tolerable range. This is called co-regulation, and it is the foundation of all emotional development. Dexter had no co-regulation in the container. His mother was dead, his brother was present, but was himself a traumatized child with no capacity to provide comfort. There was no adult, no caregiver, no soothing voice, no safe presence to help a 3-year-old nervous system process what it was experiencing. And so Dexter's nervous system did the only thing it could do. It collapsed into hypoarousal. It shut down, it disconnected cognition from emotion, and stored the entire experience in the body rather than in conscious memory. This is the moment Dexter became what the show calls a psychopath. Not because psychopathy was activated the way you activate a dormant gene, but because the emotional processing system of a 3-year-old child was catastrophically overloaded and responded by shutting itself off. The hollow place inside that Dexter describes in the first episode isn't an absence, it's a defense. It's his nervous system still protecting him from an experience it was never able to process. 30 years later, the container's over, but Dexter's body doesn't know that. His body is still in hypoarousal, still frozen, still waiting for the rescue that, emotionally speaking, never came. Which brings us to the most important question in Dexter Morgan's entire psychological history. What did Harry Morgan actually do to the boy he pulled from that shipping container? And was it help, or was it something else entirely? If this is starting to paint a picture you weren't expecting, subscribe, because we need to talk about the code. And the code, from a psychological perspective, might be the most damaging thing that ever happened to Dexter Morgan. Worse than the container. Worse than the blood, because the container was 2 days. The code was a lifetime. Harry Morgan was a good cop. Everyone who knew him said so. He was respected at Miami Metro, trusted by his colleagues, admired by his daughter Deborah. opened that shipping container and found a 3-year-old boy sitting in his mother's blood, he applied the same problem-solving instinct that made him a good cop to the challenge of raising a traumatized child. He adopted Dexter. He gave him a home, a family, a sister who would love him unconditionally for the rest of her life. He watched Dexter grow, and as the boy grew, Harry noticed things, small things at first. A distance in Dexter's eyes, an absence of emotional response where there should have been one, and then bigger things, a neighbor's dog named Buddy that went missing. Harry found the grave, and in the grave he found more than just Buddy's bones. This is the moment the show presents as the genesis of the code. Harry recognized that his adopted son had violent urges. He saw the animal killings as an early warning sign, which is clinically accurate. Cruelty to animals in childhood is one of the strongest predictors of later violent behavior. And rather than ignoring the problem, pretending it wasn't happening, or hoping Dexter would grow out of it, Harry decided to act. A psychologist would give Harry credit for that. He didn't look away. He didn't deny what he was seeing. In a situation where many parents would have retreated into wishful thinking, Harry confronted the reality of what his son was becoming. But then Harry made a decision that would shape the next 30 years of Dexter's life. And from a clinical perspective, it was catastrophic. Instead of taking Dexter to a mental health professional, instead of seeking out the kind of trauma-focused therapy that even in the 1980s and 1990s was beginning to show results with severely traumatized children, Harry decided to handle it himself. He diagnosed his own son. A homicide detective with zero clinical training looked at a child who was exhibiting symptoms of severe developmental trauma and concluded that the child was a psychopath, not traumatized, not in need of help, a psychopath, born broken, incapable of change. And then, based on that amateur diagnosis, Harry built the code. The code of Harry has 2 primary rules. Don't get caught, and only kill people who deserve it, meaning people who have killed others and escape the justice system. Around these 2 rules, Harry constructed an elaborate behavioral management system. He taught Dexter how to blend in, how to perform normalcy, how to select his victims and verify their guilt before killing them, how to dispose of bodies, how to maintain his cover as a forensic analyst while operating as a vigilante serial killer in his off hours. The show presents the code as Harry's gift to Dexter, the thing that kept him functional, the framework that channeled his darkness into something productive, or at least something less random and destructive than it might otherwise have been. And there is a version of this argument that has surface-level appeal. Without the code, the argument goes, Dexter would have become Brian, an undirected, unrestricted killer with no boundaries and no conscience. The code gave him limits. The code gave him purpose. The code saved his life. But a psychologist would see the code very differently. The code doesn't treat Dexter's trauma. It doesn't address the underlying condition. It doesn't help Dexter process the shipping container or develop genuine emotional capacity or build healthy attachment bonds. What the code does is manage symptoms while reinforcing the belief system that prevents healing. Every element of the code is predicated on the assumption that Dexter is fundamentally broken, that his urges are permanent and unchangeable, that the best possible outcome is not recovery but containment. And the most damaging thing Harry did wasn't teaching Dexter how to kill cleanly, it was telling Dexter what he was. When Harry tells Dexter he is a psychopath, he isn't delivering a clinical diagnosis based on validated assessment tools and years of professional training. He is a cop applying a criminal justice framework to a child. Harry understands psychopathy the way homicide detectives understand it, as a label for predators, for people who can't be fixed and can only be managed or locked away. And he applies that understanding to his own son. The psychological consequence of this is devastating, and it operates through a mechanism that is well documented in clinical literature, the self-fulfilling prophecy. When an authority figure, particularly a parental figure, tells a child what they are, the child believes it. Not partially, completely. The child builds their identity around the label they've been given because a child's sense of self is still forming, and the primary materials from which it is constructed are the messages received from caregivers. Harry told Dexter he was a psychopath. Dexter became one. Not because the label was accurate, but because Dexter organized his entire identity around it. I am a monster. I feel nothing. I am different from everyone. I wear a mask because there is nothing underneath it. These are not observations that Dexter arrived at through careful self-examination. They are Harry's conclusions, internalized so completely that Dexter can no longer distinguish between Harry's voice and his own. And consider the structure of the code itself. Harry didn't just tell Dexter what he was. He built a system that made it impossible for Dexter to discover otherwise. The code requires secrecy, which means Dexter can never be truly known by another person. The code requires emotional suppression, which means Dexter must actively prevent himself from feeling things that might complicate his mission. The code requires ritual, which means Dexter's compulsive behavior is not just tolerated, but formalized and reinforced. Every kill confirms the narrative. Every successful disposal proves the system works. Every moment of emotional blankness validates Harry's original assessment. The code, in other words, doesn't protect Dexter from his darkness. The code is the darkness. It is the mechanism by which Harry's misdiagnosis became Dexter's permanent reality. In Season 8, Dr. Evelyn Vogel arrives and reveals that she helped Harry create the code. Vogel is a neuropsychiatrist who has spent her career studying psychopaths. She considers Dexter her greatest achievement, proof that a psychopath can be channeled and controlled. And her involvement adds a layer of clinical legitimacy to Harry's framework that makes it even more difficult to challenge, because now it isn't just a cop's intuition, it's a doctor's prescription. But Vogel's approach was itself deeply flawed, and a psychologist trained in trauma would spot the problem immediately. Vogel's theoretical framework is rooted in biological fatalism, the belief that psychopathy is an innate neurological condition that cannot be changed, only managed. This was a common position in clinical circles for decades, and it is not entirely without basis. There is evidence that primary psychopathy has a genetic and neurological component, but Vogel applies this framework to Dexter without ever asking the question that matters. Is Dexter's condition actually innate, or is it the result of the catastrophic trauma he experienced at age 3? She never asks because she doesn't need to. Her theory works whether Dexter is a born psychopath or a traumatized child, because the management protocol is the same either way. Control the behavior, channel the urges, accept that the underlying condition is permanent. Vogel doesn't need to diagnose Dexter correctly in order to feel validated by his existence. She just needs him to keep functioning within the framework she helped design. And when Dexter shows signs of emotional growth, when his attachments deepen and his guilt increases and his interest in killing wanes, Vogel doesn't treat these developments as evidence of healing. She treats them as anomalies, inconveniences, threats to the clean narrative that her framework requires. A psychologist watching this would want to scream, because what Vogel is observing is exactly what you would expect to see if Dexter's condition were trauma-based rather than constitutional. Emotional capacity returning over time, attachment bonds strengthening, antisocial behavior moderating with age. These are signs of recovery, and Vogel either can't see them or won't, because seeing them would mean admitting that her entire career's work was built on the wrong assumption. And then there's Harry's suicide. This is the detail that reveals the full scope of the tragedy. Harry walked in on Dexter dismembering a victim. He saw what the code actually produced in practice, not the clean theoretical framework he had designed, but the blood-soaked reality of a young man cutting another human being into pieces. And it destroyed him. Harry went home and killed himself. The show presents this as a man who couldn't live with what he'd created. But a psychologist would see something more specific. Harry's suicide wasn't just guilt. It was the collapse of a defense mechanism. Harry had built the code as a way to manage his own anxiety about Dexter, to create the illusion that the problem was under control, that the system was working. When he saw the dismemberment, the illusion shattered. The system wasn't working. The system had produced exactly the outcome Harry feared most, a killer who kills efficiently and without remorse. And Harry, who had invested everything in the belief that his approach was the right one, could not survive the realization that it wasn't. The alternative history question is one the show never asks because asking it would undermine the entire premise. But a psychologist would ask it, and the answer is devastating. What if, instead of building the code, Harry had taken 3-year-old Dexter to a child psychologist who specialized in developmental trauma? What if that psychologist had recognized the dissociative patterns, the attachment disruption, the sensory imprints from the shipping container? What if Dexter had received EMDR, or trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or attachment-based intervention? Would the boy who sat in his mother's blood have become the man who collects blood on glass slides? We can't know for certain. Not every traumatized child responds to treatment. But the clinical literature suggests that early intervention for developmental trauma can produce significant, lasting changes in emotional capacity and behavioral regulation. The possibility existed, and nobody, not Harry, not Vogel, not anyone in Dexter's life, ever tried. That is Harry's true legacy, not a code that kept Dexter functional. A missed opportunity that kept Dexter trapped. If you're settling in, and this is the kind of steady, thoughtful analysis that works for winding down, subscribe. Because we're about to look at what Dexter's mask is really hiding, and it's not what you think. My name is Dexter Morgan. I don't know what made me the way I am, but whatever it was left a hollow place inside. People fake a lot of human interactions, but I feel like I fake them all, and I fake them very well. And that's my burden, I guess. Those words open the very first episode, and they tell you everything about how Dexter understands himself. He believes there is a hollow place inside him. He believes his emotional life is entirely performed. He believes, with total conviction, that the person other people see when they look at him is a character he is playing, and that behind the character there is nothing, an absence, a void where a human being should be. The show takes this self-assessment at face value. The audience takes it at face value. Even the show's writers seem to take it at face value, constructing season after season around the premise that Dexter is a convincing shell with nothing inside it. And Dexter himself reinforces this narrative constantly in his internal monologue, in his interactions with Harry's ghost, in the way he describes his own experience to the rare people who learn his secret. A psychologist would not take it at face value. A psychologist would recognize this self-description for what it is, which is a dissociative narrative. A story a traumatized person tells themselves about their own inner life, not because the story is accurate, but because the story serves a protective function. When a child experiences severe trauma at an age too young to process it, and is subsequently told by a trusted authority figure that they are incapable of genuine emotion, the child doesn't just accept this as one piece of information among many. The child builds their entire sense of self around it. The message becomes the architecture of their identity. And once that architecture is in place, the person will interpret every subsequent experience through the lens of that original message, discounting or dismissing any evidence that contradicts it. Dexter feels grief when Rita dies. But because his identity is organized around the premise that he can't feel, he experiences this grief as confusing and alien, something that shouldn't be happening rather than something natural and expected. He cares about Deborah so deeply that he consistently prioritizes her safety above his own survival. But because the narrative says he wears a mask, he interprets this care as another performance, a particularly convincing one that even he has started to believe. He experiences guilt and self-recrimination and emotional pain throughout the later seasons. But because Harry told him he was empty inside, He dismisses these experiences as glitches in the system rather than evidence that the system's premise is wrong. The mask, in clinical terms, is not covering an empty void. The mask is covering a locked room, and inside that locked room are decades of unfelt feelings, unprocessed grief, unacknowledged love, and the overwhelming terror of a 3-year-old boy who watched his mother die and was never allowed to cry about it. The emotions aren't absent, they're quarantined, sealed behind a dissociative barrier so thick that even Dexter doesn't know they're there. But the emotions leak through, constantly, in ways that Dexter cannot explain within his own framework and that the show consistently presents without fully acknowledging what they mean. When Dexter hesitates to kill his brother Brian in the season 1 finale, that hesitation is not a malfunction in his programming, it's love. He loves his brother. He feels the pull of biological connection, of shared experience, of being understood by someone who sat in the same blood. And he kills Brian anyway to protect Deborah, which is an act of choosing one love over another. A psychopath wouldn't hesitate. A psychopath wouldn't feel the pull. A psychopath wouldn't need to choose because the choice would be obvious and emotionless. Dexter's hesitation is the evidence. The mask slips, and what's underneath is not emptiness, but anguish. When Deborah is in danger, any danger from any source, Dexter's response is immediate and visceral. His body language changes, his voice changes. The careful performance drops away, and what you see is a man in genuine distress. Not calculated distress, not performed distress. The kind of distress that bypasses the prefrontal cortex entirely and comes straight from the amygdala, the same threat detection system that was hyperactivated in that shipping container 30 years ago. And then there's the conversation about the dark passenger that happens in season 7. Hannah McKay, one of the few people who sees through Dexter's narrative, challenges the entire concept. "You're not a puppet," she tells him. "Of course you have a choice." And later, Harry's ghost, the internalized voice of the man who created the framework, admits the truth. "The dark passenger was all yours," Harry says. "I gave you the code." Dexter's response to this revelation is the single most important psychological moment in the entire series. "If there's no dark passenger," he said, "then I'm responsible for everything I've done." And there it is, the reason Dexter needs the mask, the dark passenger, the psychopath label, the entire narrative framework that Harry built and Vogel validated. He needs it because the alternative is unbearable. If there's no dark passenger, if there's no innate darkness that makes his behavior inevitable, then Dexter is not a monster. He's a person who has murdered over 100 people. And a person, unlike a monster, has to feel the weight of that. A person has to grieve for what they've done. A person has to sit with the guilt and the horror and the knowledge that things could have been different. The mask isn't protecting Dexter from the world. The mask is protecting Dexter from himself, from the full force of his own emotional reality, from the 3-year-old boy who is still in that container, still waiting for the feelings to be allowed. If you're drifting off and this is helping, good. Let it wash over you. Subscribe if you haven't. And let's keep going, because we need to talk about the kill room. And the kill room is where Dexter's psychology gets really deeply strange. There is a moment in every kill that Dexter performs where the audience is meant to feel satisfaction. The victim is wrapped in plastic, they're strapped to a table. Dexter has arranged photographs of their crimes around the room so the victim can see what they've done. And then Dexter leans in close, says something that connects this kill to the larger narrative, and draws a single drop of blood onto a glass slide before plunging his knife into their chest. The show frames this as justice, catharsis, the righteous elimination of someone who escaped the legal system. And on a narrative level, it works. The viewer gets the pleasure of watching a bad person receive consequences. The show gives us enough information about each victim to make us comfortable with their death, sometimes even eager for it. But a psychologist would see something entirely different happening in the kill room, something far more personal and far more sad. Dexter's kill ritual is a trauma reenactment. Trauma reenactment is a well-documented phenomenon in which survivors of severe trauma compulsively recreate elements of the original traumatic experience. They don't do this consciously. They don't do it because they enjoy it. They do it because the unprocessed trauma creates a kind of gravitational pull that keeps dragging them back to the scene of the wound, and the unconscious mind, unable to resolve the original experience, keeps staging new versions of it in the hope that this time something will be different. This time, maybe the trauma will be processed and the cycle will end. Look at the elements of Dexter's ritual and compare them to the shipping container. The kill room is an enclosed space, just like the container. The walls are covered in plastic sheeting, creating a sealed, controlled environment. Blood is present always in the form of the slide Dexter takes. The victim is helpless, restrained, unable to move. And Dexter is in control. That's the key difference between the ritual and the original trauma. In the container, Dexter was the helpless one. He was 3 years old, powerless, unable to stop what was happening. In the kill room, Dexter is the one with power. He decides who lives and who dies. He controls the blood. He controls the space, he controls the outcome. The ritual is Dexter's way of rewriting the shipping container with himself in the position of authority. It transforms his original helplessness into agency. Every kill is on some level Dexter telling the universe, I am not the child in the container anymore. I am the one who decides what happens in rooms like this. And the blood slides are perhaps the most psychologically revealing detail in the entire show. Each slide contains a single drop of blood from a victim. Dexter collects them, organizes them, stores them in a neat box inside his air conditioning unit. He looks at them, he catalogs them, he treats them like precious objects. Blood is the central sensory element of Dexter's trauma. It's the substance that surrounded him for 2 days. It's the material that defined the worst moment of his life. And by collecting it, by controlling it, by organizing it into neat little rectangles of glass, Dexter's attempting to master the experience that shattered him. If he can control blood, contain it, reduce it to an object he can hold in his hand and examine at his leisure, then maybe blood doesn't have to mean what it meant in the container. Maybe it can mean something else, something he chose rather than something that was inflicted on him. The code adds another layer to this. By restricting his kills to other killers, the code transforms Dexter's compulsion from senseless violence into justice. It gives his trauma meaning. It allows him to see himself not as a predator, but as a protector, the person who stops bad people from hurting innocents. In other words, it allows him to be the thing that Harry wasn't, the person who shows up in time, who rescues the helpless, who makes sure what happened in the container never happens to anyone else. This is why Dexter's killing feels meaningful to him in a way that transcends the physical act. The kill room isn't just a murder scene, it's a therapeutic space where Dexter processes his deepest emotions through the only channel available to him. The problem is that the channel is murder. The processing involves killing a human being rather than sitting with a therapist and doing the actual emotional work of healing. It provides temporary relief, a brief sense of mastery and control, but it never resolves the underlying wound, and so the compulsion returns again and again and again. Because the reenactment can never provide what actual therapy would, it can only repeat. A psychologist watching Dexter's ritual would see a man who is closer to a compulsive self-harmer than a traditional predator. The kills aren't driven by sadistic pleasure or a desire for power over others in the way classical psychopathic violence is driven. They're driven by an unprocessed wound that keeps demanding attention. And the only language Dexter has for addressing that wound is the language Harry gave him. The language of the code. The language of blood. If you're comfortable and this is doing its job, stay right there. Subscribe and settle in. Because next we need to talk about the people Dexter loved. And yes, I said loved, because that's the point. He wasn't supposed to be able to. Dexter initially chose Rita Bennett as his girlfriend for reasons that he describes as purely strategic. Rita was a survivor of domestic violence. Her ex-husband, Paul, had been physically abusive, and the trauma left her with low expectations for intimacy and physical closeness. Serve as convincing cover for his real serve as convincing cover for his real life without requiring him to actually be present in the relationship. That's what Dexter tells himself. That's the narrative the mask provides. And in the early episodes, it's a plausible one. Dexter uses Rita. He performs the boyfriend role competently, showing up when expected, saying the right things, being patient with her children, Aster and Cody. He is the picture of a functional partner, and the audience understands because Dexter tells us that none of it is real. But then something happens that Dexter's framework cannot explain. Over 4 seasons, across countless small moments and shared experiences, and the ordinary accumulation of time spent with another person, Dexter falls in love with Rita. Not in a way he plans or expects or even recognizes until it's too late. It happens the way love happens for people who aren't psychopaths, gradually through familiarity and care, and the slow erosion of barriers. By season 4, Dexter has married Rita. They have a son, Harrison, and Dexter's internal monologue has shifted in ways that are clinically significant. He worries about being a good husband. He wants to be present for his family. He struggles to balance his normal life with his killing because the normal life has become more than just cover. It has become something he values for its own sake. He wonders, watching Arthur Mitchell's seemingly perfect family, whether he can have it all. Whether a man like him can be a killer and a father and a husband and somehow make all of those things coexist. A psychopath wouldn't wonder. A psychopath would simply use the family as cover and feel no conflict about it. The fact that Dexter experiences genuine internal struggle about his dual life is, in itself, evidence that his emotional capacity is far greater than the psychopath narrative allows. And then Rita dies. The season 4 finale is, for my money, the most psychologically significant episode in the entire series. Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity Killer, murders Rita in her bathtub. She bleeds out. And when Dexter comes home expecting to find his wife packing for their honeymoon trip to the Florida Keys, he instead finds her dead in a pool of blood with their infant son Harrison sitting on the floor beside her. Sitting in the blood, just like Dexter sat in his mother's blood 30 years earlier. The visual parallel is deliberate and devastating. The show is telling us that the cycle has repeated, that Dexter's original trauma has reproduced itself, and now his son will carry the same wound. And Dexter's reaction to this scene tells you everything about what he actually is. He breaks. Not in the controlled, calculated way that a psychopath might simulate emotion for strategic purposes. Dexter breaks the way a person breaks when the thing they love most in the world is taken from them. His grief is physical, audible, uncontrollable. In the aftermath, he kills a man in a gas station bathroom, not a verified killer who meets the code's criteria, but a random man who happened to be in the wrong place when Dexter's emotional dam finally burst. It's the most human moment Dexter has ever had, and it's triggered by the most inhuman thing that has ever happened to him. Harry's ghost tells Dexter that it was the first human thing you've done, but that's Harry's framework talking. A psychologist would say it was the first time Dexter's dissociative barriers failed completely. The first time the emotions he had been told he didn't have overwhelmed the system designed to contain them. It wasn't the first human thing, it was the first time the human underneath was too loud to ignore. Then there's Deborah. And Deborah is the relationship that breaks the entire psychopath theory wide open because there is simply no clinical framework in which a person with primary psychopathy maintains the kind of bond that Dexter maintains with his sister across 8 seasons. Dexter doesn't just care about Deborah, He loves her in the way that only deeply attached siblings can, with a protectiveness that is reflexive and absolute and older than either of them can remember. When Deborah is in danger, Dexter doesn't calculate the strategic value of saving her. He acts immediately, without regard for his own safety or the preservation of his secret or the rules of the code. The attachment supersedes everything. And when Deborah discovers Dexter's secret, when she walks in on him killing Travis Marshall in the season 6 finale, and the entire foundation of her reality collapses, Dexter's response is not the cold, clinical damage control of a psychopath managing a security breach. He's terrified, not of being caught, terrified of losing her, terrified of what this knowledge will do to the person he loves most. And he's right to be terrified, because what follows is the systematic destruction of Deborah Morgan's entire psychological life. And Dexter has to watch it happen knowing that he caused it. His attachment style across all of his relationships is what psychologists call disorganized attachment. This is the attachment pattern that develops in children whose caregiving environment was simultaneously a source of comfort and a source of fear. The child learns to crave connection and dread it simultaneously. They reach out and then pull away. They let people close and then destroy the closeness through secrecy, deception, or sabotage. They want to be known and are terrified of what will happen if they are. Dexter exhibits every feature of disorganized attachment. He craves connection with Rita, with Deborah, with Hannah McKay, with his son Harrison. But he can never fully let them in, because letting them in would mean showing them what he is, and what he is, according to the narrative Harry built, is a monster. So he keeps secrets, he lies, he manipulates, he holds people close with one hand and pushes them away with the other. And every time a relationship fails, every time someone is hurt or killed because of his dual life, it confirms the original narrative. See? I'm a monster. This is what happens when monsters try to love people. Harry was right all along, but a psychologist would see the pattern differently. The pattern doesn't prove that Dexter can't love. It proves that Dexter was never taught how. He was taught to perform. He was taught to hide. He was taught that his real self was unacceptable, and that the only version of him that could exist in relationship with other people was the mask. And when the mask isn't enough, when love demands more than performance, Dexter retreats back into the identity that feels safest, the killer, the monster, the dark passenger, because at least that identity is predictable. At least that identity has rules. And then there's Hannah McKay. Hannah is the relationship that challenges Dexter's self-understanding more than any other, because Hannah is the first person in Dexter's life who sees through the mask and doesn't run away or try to fix him. She is herself a killer. She poisoned her way through a series of obstacles in her life, and when Dexter discovers this, he is supposed to kill her. She meets the code's criteria. She is a murderer who escaped justice. The code says she should be on his table, but Dexter can't do it. He tries, he has her on the table, the plastic is up, the moment arrives, and he can't do it, not because he makes a strategic decision to spare her, not because some calculation tells him she's more useful alive. He can't do it because he has developed feelings for her that override the code, and that fact terrifies him, because feelings aren't supposed to override the code. The code is supposed to be absolute. It's the one thing Harry gave him that is supposed to be stronger than everything else. Hannah represents something that Dexter's framework has no category for. She is a person who knows exactly what he is and chooses to be with him anyway. She doesn't need the mask. She doesn't need the performance. She is, in a sense, the healthy version of what Brian offered in season 1, someone who sees Dexter and accepts him. But where Brian's acceptance was rooted in shared pathology, Hannah's acceptance is rooted in something closer to genuine intimacy. She challenges his narratives. She pushes back on the dark passenger. She tells him he has a choice. And Dexter, for the first time, begins to believe her. In their conversations about the dark passenger, he admits that maybe it's not real. Maybe it's just a feeling. Maybe, as Hannah suggests, he's not a puppet. Maybe he's a person who has been told he's a puppet so many times that he forgot he has hands. This is clinically significant. Hannah doesn't cure Dexter. She doesn't provide therapy, but she creates a context in which Dexter can begin to question the narrative that defines him. And the fact that he can question it, that he can entertain the possibility that the dark passenger is a construct rather than an innate force, is more evidence that his condition is psychological rather than biological. A person with primary psychopathy wouldn't question their nature because they wouldn't experience their nature as problematic. Dexter's ability to doubt, to wonder, to entertain alternatives is itself a symptom of the emotional capacity he was told he doesn't have. Of course, the relationship with Hannah ends badly, as all of Dexter's relationships do. Not because Dexter is incapable of love, but because the structures of his life, the secrecy, the killing, the code, are incompatible with the sustained vulnerability that love requires. Every time Dexter gets close enough to someone that the mask begins to dissolve, something happens to reassert the old pattern. Someone dies, someone is endangered. The code demands his attention. And Dexter, who has never learned to prioritize connection over compulsion, falls back into the only identity he knows. The pattern across all of Dexter's relationships tells the same story. With Rita, with Deborah, with Hannah, with Harrison, Dexter demonstrates the capacity for deep, genuine emotional connection. And then he destroys it. Not because he wants to, not because the destruction gives him pleasure, but because the architecture of his life, the code, the mask, the secret, is fundamentally incompatible with the sustained openness and honesty that real relationships require. A psychologist would describe this as a repetition compulsion driven by disorganized attachment. Dexter is caught in a loop. He reaches for connection. Connection triggers vulnerability. Vulnerability triggers the dissociative defense. The defense reasserts the mask. And the mask, by its very nature, destroys the connection that triggered the whole sequence. The loop repeats, again and again. Not because Dexter is a monster who can't love, but because he is a wounded man who was never taught that love and safety could coexist. If this is hitting in a way you didn't expect, subscribe. Stay right there and keep listening. Because we're about to look at the people who held up mirrors to Dexter's psychology. And what he saw in those mirrors changes everything. Every season of Dexter introduces a central antagonist, and the show's creators were smart enough to make each one a psychological mirror. Each big bad forces Dexter to confront a specific question about himself. Who am I without the code? Can I have a real family? Am I capable of change? And when you line those antagonists up in sequence, you get something that looks a lot like a therapeutic journey that never reaches resolution, because Dexter never has a therapist to help him integrate what he's learning. Let's start with Brian Moser, the ice truck killer, in season 1. Brian is Dexter's biological brother. He experienced the same shipping container trauma. He sat in the same blood. But where Dexter was given the code and a family and a structure, Brian was discarded, sent through foster homes, institutionalized, abandoned by the system and by the man, Harry Morgan, who chose to save one brother and forget the other. Brian represents the path not taken. He is the version of Dexter that exists without intervention. And when Dexter meets Brian, something fascinating happens. He feels drawn to him. Not just because of blood relation, but because Brian is the first person who has ever truly understood what Dexter is. Brian doesn't need the mask. Brian doesn't require the performance. Around Brian, Dexter can relax in a way he has never been able to relax around anyone else. And that's what makes the season 1 finale so psychologically significant. Dexter has to choose between Brian and Deborah. Chooses Deborah. He kills his own brother to save his own life. He chooses to be a monster. 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 He chooses Deborah. He kills his own brother to protect his sister. A psychologist would say that in that moment, Dexter demonstrated something that primary psychopathy cannot produce. He demonstrated that his attachment bonds, fragile and complicated as they are, outweigh his drive toward connection with someone who mirrors his trauma. He chose love over understanding. That is not the act of a man without feelings. Then there's Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity Killer, Season 4. And this is the antagonist that matters most for understanding Dexter's psychology. Arthur Mitchell is, on the surface, everything Dexter dreams of being. A family man, a husband, a father, a respected member of his community who builds houses for the poor through his 4 walls, 1 heart foundation. When Dexter first encounters Arthur before he knows the full truth, he's fascinated. Here is a serial killer who has successfully maintained a family life for decades. Here is proof that it can be done, that you can be what Dexter is and still have what Dexter wants. Dexter even begins to study Arthur. He observes his routines, he shadows his family outings. He tries to learn from him as though Arthur Mitchell is a mentor who can teach him the secret of having it all. And then the truth emerges. Arthur's family isn't held together by love. It's held together by terror. His wife flinches when he enters a room. His daughter is isolated and controlled. His son is beaten into submission. The picture-perfect family is a prison, and Arthur is the warden. The house he builds for the poor is a monument to the same compulsive ritual that drives his killing cycle, a pattern that repeats itself with mechanical precision across decades and across the country. What Dexter sees when he looks behind Arthur's mask is his own future. If he stays on his current path, if he continues to believe that the code can coexist with genuine family life, this is where it ends, not with the happy balance he imagined, but with a household of hostages, a wife who's afraid to speak, children who've learned that love and violence are interchangeable, and Arthur's 4 kill cycle mirrors and expands Dexter's understanding of his own compulsion. Arthur kidnaps a young boy, forces a woman to jump to her death, kills a woman in a bathtub, and bludgeons a man with a hammer. Each kill corresponds to a traumatic event from Arthur's own childhood. He is trapped in a ritual just as Dexter is trapped in his. And neither of them can stop, because neither of them has ever addressed the original wound that drives the cycle. When Arthur murders Rita and leaves Harrison sitting in her blood, the mirror becomes complete. Arthur has done to Dexter what the universe did to 3-year-old Dexter Moser. He has murdered a mother and left a child in the aftermath. And Dexter, standing in that bathroom, realizes that the cycle isn't something he can manage or contain. It reproduces itself. It finds new victims. It passes from generation to generation like a virus that kills everything it touches. The third mirror that deserves attention is Dr. Evelyn Vogel in Season 8. Vogel is a neuropsychiatrist who arrives claiming to have helped Harry create the code. She tells Dexter that he is, in a sense, her creation. She studied psychopaths. She designed the framework that shaped his life, and she considers him her greatest success. But Vogel doesn't see Dexter. She sees her theory. She sees a validation of her approach, her career, her belief that psychopathy is a biological condition that can be channeled but never changed. When Dexter shows signs of emotional growth, of genuine attachment and guilt and self-questioning, Vogel doesn't celebrate these as evidence of healing. She treats them as anomalies, inconveniences, threats to the clean narrative that her framework requires. Vogel represents the clinical establishment that labeled Dexter rather than treated him. She is the professional version of Harry's mistake, applying a framework to a patient without questioning whether the framework fits. And her death at the hands of another one of her former patients, the brain surgeon, is symbolically significant. The approach she championed, the biological fatalism that said psychopaths can be managed but never healed, kills her, literally. The system she built turns on its creator, just as Harry's system destroyed Harry, just as the code continues to devour everything Dexter touches. Each antagonist, taken together, tells a story about the questions Dexter needs answered but can never quite reach. Brian asks, "Who would I be without the code?" Arthur asks, "What happens if I try to have a family without addressing what's actually wrong with me?" Vogel asks, "What if the people who were supposed to help me were wrong about what I am?" And the show, because it accepts the premise that Dexter is a psychopath, can never give him satisfying answers. The questions keep repeating because the underlying condition keeps going untreated. Which brings us to the question at the heart of everything. The question the show poses from the very first episode and never truly resolves. Was Dexter Morgan born this way, or was he made? If you're settling in and this is getting you sleepy in the best possible way, hit subscribe, because the nature versus nurture debate is where the psychology gets really interesting. The show's official answer to the nature versus nurture question is clear. Born in blood. That's the phrase that echoes throughout the series. Dexter was born in a shipping container surrounded by blood and violence, and that experience activated something that was already inside him. The dark passenger was always there, waiting. The trauma just gave it a way in. This is biological fatalism, and the show commits to it fully. The dark passenger as innate force. Vogel's belief that psychopathy is genetic and permanent. Harry's conviction that Dexter's urges were a biological inevitability that could only be managed, never cured. But what does the actual research say? The relationship between childhood trauma and psychopathic traits has been studied extensively, and the findings are far more nuanced than the show suggests. Research on childhood betrayal trauma has demonstrated that exposure to severe early trauma is associated with the development of callous and unemotional traits in adulthood. But, and this is the critical point, this association is mediated by dissociative experiences. The trauma doesn't directly produce psychopathy. It produces dissociation, which then produces behaviors and traits that look like psychopathy. The underlying mechanism is defense, not deficit. Other studies on violent offenders have found that early exposure to relational trauma in childhood plays a significant role in the development of more severe psychopathic traits. The research found that the link between early adverse childhood experiences and psychopathy is real and measurable. But the researchers were careful to distinguish between psychopathic traits that emerge from trauma, which is secondary psychopathy, and psychopathic traits that appear to have a genetic or neurological basis, which is primary psychopathy. These are fundamentally different conditions with fundamentally different prognoses, even though they can look identical on a checklist like the PCLR. Dexter's presentation is far more consistent with secondary psychopathy than with primary. The evidence for this is overwhelming. His condition emerged after a specific, identifiable traumatic event. His emotional capacity, while suppressed, demonstrably exists and grows over time. He forms genuine attachments that deepen and evolve. He experiences guilt, grief, and self-recrimination. He questions his own identity and his own choices. None of these are consistent with primary psychopathy, which is characterized by stable, lifelong emotional deficit that does not change with time or circumstance. And here's something else the research tells us that the show never addresses. Antisocial personality disorder, the diagnostic category that most closely maps onto what the show calls psychopathy, tends to moderate itself around age 35. People with ASPD, particularly those whose condition is rooted in environmental factors, often show a natural reduction in antisocial behavior and an increase in emotional capacity as they age. And look at what happens to Dexter across the timeline of the series. He becomes less interested in killing. He struggles to maintain the compulsion. He becomes more emotionally available, more capable of connection, more troubled by the consequences of his actions. This is entirely consistent with the clinical trajectory of secondary ASPD. His condition is moderating itself, just as the research predicts. But the show can't acknowledge this because the show has built its entire narrative on the premise that Dexter's condition is permanent and unchangeable. If Dexter can change, if he's capable of healing, then the code becomes not just unnecessary but actively harmful. It becomes the thing that prevented his recovery rather than the thing that kept him functional. And the show isn't willing to go there because going there means admitting that Harry was wrong, Vogel was wrong, and the entire conceptual framework that makes the show possible was built on a misdiagnosis. What does all of this mean for Dexter? It means that his condition was almost certainly treatable, possibly from the very beginning. If the 3-year-old boy in the shipping container had received proper trauma-focused therapy, attachment intervention, and appropriate psychiatric care, there is a reasonable clinical basis to believe his life could have been different. Not guaranteed. Not every child with Dexter's level of trauma can be fully healed. But the possibility existed, and nobody, not Harry, not Vogel, not anyone, ever tried. That is the fundamental tragedy. Dexter Morgan wasn't born a killer, he was made one. And the people who made him, the father who diagnosed him incorrectly, and the psychiatrist who validated that diagnosis, did so out of a combination of love, ignorance, and a theoretical framework that the evidence doesn't support. The show says Dexter is fate. The research says Dexter is damage. And the difference between those two words is the difference between a man who was doomed from birth and a man who was failed by everyone he trusted. If you're still listening, and I know this is a lot, stay with me, because we need to talk about the person who paid the highest price for Harry's mistake. The person whose destruction is the clearest measure of the damage Dexter causes, and it's not any of his victims, it's his sister. Subscribe and get comfortable because this section is about Deborah Morgan, and it's going to hurt. Deborah Morgan's psychological arc across 8 seasons is, in many ways, more devastating than Dexter's, because Dexter was given a framework, however twisted, for understanding what he was. He had the code, he had the mask, he had the narrative of the dark passenger. These things were damaging, yes, but they were also organizing. They gave his trauma structure and his violence meaning. Deborah had none of that. She was raised alongside a serial killer in a home shaped by secrets she wasn't allowed to know. By a father who prioritized his adopted son's darkness over his biological daughter's well-being. And when the truth finally emerged, it destroyed her. A psychologist would find Deborah's case particularly heartbreaking because, of all the characters in the series, she is the one who most clearly demonstrates the collateral damage of untreated trauma. Dexter's trauma is the originating wound. Deborah's trauma is the secondary blast. She wasn't in the shipping container, she didn't sit in the blood, she didn't lose her mother to a chainsaw, but she grew up in the fallout of all those things, in a household that was organized around managing her brother's darkness. And the radiation from that fallout was enough to destroy her. Consider what Deborah's childhood actually looked like, even though the show only gives us glimpses. She grew up in a home where her father was preoccupied with a secret he couldn't share. Harry spent enormous emotional energy on Dexter, on managing the code, on teaching his adopted son the rules that would keep him contained. That energy had to come from somewhere, and the most likely source was the attention and emotional availability that should have been directed toward Deborah. She grew up feeling on some level she couldn't articulate that she was second, that her brother mattered more, that whatever was happening behind the closed doors of Harry's conversations with Dexter was more important than anything happening in her life. This is a form of emotional neglect, and it doesn't require malice. Harry didn't neglect Deborah because he didn't love her. He neglected her because he was consumed by a crisis he believed was life or death. And in that crisis, Deborah's emotional needs became secondary. The result is a child who learns to be self-sufficient too early, who learns to perform competence and independence because those are the qualities that get attention in a household where the real attention is directed elsewhere. Deborah becomes a cop, just like Harry. She becomes tough, foul-mouthed, driven. She organizes her entire identity around being strong enough to not need the support that was never offered. And then, piece by piece, the truth invades her life. Deborah starts the series as a confident, ambitious, foul-mouthed cop. She's rough around the edges, but fundamentally good. She believes in justice, in the system, in her family. She idolizes her father. She loves her brother. She's the most authentically human character in the entire show, which is exactly why her destruction carries so much weight. And then, piece by piece, the truth invades her life. She discovers that Dexter is her biological brother's biological brother, which means Dexter's origin story was kept from her. She discovers that her father had an affair with Dexter's mother. She discovers that Harry committed suicide, that the man she worshipped died by his own hand because of what he'd done to Dexter. Each revelation erodes her foundation a little more. But the real devastation begins when Deborah discovers that Dexter is a serial killer. The person she loves most in the world, the person she has organized her entire life around protecting and supporting, is a murderer. And not just any murderer, a methodical, ritualistic killer who has been lying to her expertly and deliberately for her entire life. The psychological impact of this discovery is difficult to overstate. Deborah doesn't just lose her brother, she loses her reality. Everything she believed about her family, her father, her childhood is retroactively contaminated. Was scared was the person she should have, was scared was the person she should have been scared of. The person who made her feel safe was the most dangerous person in her life. And then, in the season 7 finale, Deborah makes the choice that ends her. She walks into a shipping container, the same kind of container where Dexter's trauma began, and she finds Dexter about to kill Maria LaGuardia, who has figured out his secret. LaGuardia is on the ground. Dexter is standing over her. And Deborah has to choose between her brother and the law, between the person she loves and the person she is. She shoots LaGuardia, In that moment, everything that makes Deborah who she is, her integrity, her moral code, her belief in justice, dies alongside Lagerta. What follows is a textbook case of what psychologists call moral injury. Moral injury occurs when a person commits an act that violates their deepest moral beliefs, and the resulting psychological damage can be more devastating than the trauma of being victimized. It's the same concept that applies to soldiers who commit acts in combat that violate their moral code. The wound isn't physical, it's existential. The person can no longer reconcile who they believe themselves to be with what they've done. Deborah's subsequent spiral is clinically precise in its presentation. She develops severe PTSD symptoms. She turns to alcohol and drugs. She becomes suicidal. She confesses to killing Lagerta while intoxicated, nearly blowing Dexter's cover. When Vogel takes her back to a shipping container for therapy, Deborah relives the moment and admits that she had a memory or a fantasy of shooting Dexter instead of Lagerta. And she's not sure whether that image made her feel better or worse. That's moral injury in its purest form. The victim isn't just processing what happened. They're processing the realization that they are capable of something they never believed possible. And they're grappling with the terrifying question of whether they would do it differently if they could go back. Deborah Morgan is the true victim of the code. Harry created the code to protect Dexter, but he never once considered what the code would do to Deborah. She was raised in the same house, exposed to the same atmosphere of secrecy and violence, but she was kept in the dark about all of it. She was left to develop normally while living in profoundly abnormal conditions. And when the truth finally reached her, she had no framework, no code, no mask, no narrative to contain it. She was hit with the full, unmediated force of a reality that Dexter had spent his entire life building walls against. Everyone in Dexter's life prioritizes his needs over Deborah's well-being. Harry focused all his energy on managing Dexter's darkness and left Deborah to raise herself emotionally. Vogel treated Deborah as a peripheral concern, a side effect of the real project. Even Deborah herself organized her life around supporting Dexter's needs, becoming a parentified sibling who assumed responsibility for her brother's emotional well-being at the expense of her own. And Deborah's death in the season 8 finale is the final proof that the code doesn't work. Not because Dexter failed to follow it, but because the code was never designed to account for the collateral damage it would cause. Harry built a system to protect Dexter from the world. He never built a system to protect the world from the consequences of that protection. And Deborah, who loved Dexter more than anyone else in his life, paid the ultimate price for that oversight. When Dexter disconnects Deborah's life support and carries her body to his boat, the look on his face is not the look of a psychopath disposing of evidence. It's the look of a man whose heart has been cut out of his chest. And the fact that Dexter even has a heart to cut out is the whole point of this analysis. He was never what they said he was. He was always something else, something that might have been saved if anyone had tried. If this is hitting different than you expected, subscribe. We're in the final stretch now, and we still need to talk about Harrison and the cycle that just keeps turning. Harrison Morgan sits on the floor of a bathroom in Miami, surrounded by his mother's blood. He is not yet 2 years old. He doesn't understand what has happened. He doesn't know that his mother, Rita, has been murdered by a man named Arthur Mitchell. He doesn't know that this bathroom, this blood, this moment is a precise echo of something that happened to his father 30 years earlier in a shipping container at the port of Miami. But his brain is recording everything, the warmth of the blood cooling against his skin, the quality of the light, the sounds of the house, or the absence of sounds, the long wait before someone comes. All of it is being written into his nervous system at a level below conscious memory, in the same way Dexter's nervous system recorded the container and the chainsaw and the 2-day wait in the dark. Harrison won't remember this when he's older, but his body will. A psychologist looking at this scene would recognize it immediately. This is intergenerational trauma in its most literal form. The same traumatic experience, a child sitting in a murdered parent's blood, repeating across generations, not because of genetics, not because of some inherited dark passenger that passes from father to son through DNA, but because trauma, when left untreated, reproduces the conditions of its own creation. Dexter's untreated trauma created a life so saturated with violence that it eventually bled, literally, into the next generation. And this is where we need to talk about a concept that psychologists call the transmission of trauma, because it operates through mechanisms that are far more insidious and far more preventable than genetic inheritance. Trauma transmits itself not through blood, but through behavior, through the ways a traumatized parent relates to their child, through the emotional climate of the home, through the things that are said, and more importantly, through the things that are never said. Dexter transmitted his trauma to Harrison in multiple ways. First, through the literal repetition of the original traumatic event, Harrison sitting in blood, but also through absence. After Rita's death, Dexter left Harrison in the care of his maternal grandparents, and then, after the events of season 8, abandoned him entirely. He faked his own death and disappeared to Oregon, leaving his son to grow up believing his father was dead. The impact of paternal abandonment on child development is one of the most thoroughly researched areas in developmental psychology. Children who lose a father through death, abandonment, or incarceration show elevated rates of behavioral problems, emotional dysregulation, attachment disorders, and yes, callous unemotional traits. The mechanism isn't genetic. It's developmental. The child's brain needed a primary attachment figure during critical windows of development, and that figure wasn't there. The absence itself becomes a kind of trauma, a chronic, low-grade wound that shapes the child's relationship to trust, to authority, to their own emotional needs. Harrison grew up in foster care. He was passed between families. He developed behavioral problems that made him difficult to place. By the time he arrives in Iron Lake as a teenager in Dexter, New Blood, he is angry, volatile, and confused. He has violent impulses he doesn't understand. He hurts people and feels a mix of satisfaction and horror that he can't reconcile. He is, in many ways, a younger version of his father, and the show wants us to believe this is because the dark passenger is hereditary. But look at Harrison's history through a clinical lens rather than a narrative one, and the picture is entirely different. Harrison experienced a catastrophic loss before age 2. He then experienced the loss of his primary remaining attachment figure through abandonment. He was raised in the child welfare system, which, despite the best intentions of the people who work within it, is a known source of additional trauma for children who have already experienced early attachment disruption. He was denied the stable, consistent caregiving that a child's developing brain requires to build a neural architecture for emotional regulation, impulse control, and empathy. You don't need a dark passenger to explain Harrison. You need a developmental psychology textbook. Every single risk factor for the development of aggressive behavior and callous traits in children is present in his history. If Harrison had been born to completely different parents with no connection to Dexter Morgan at all, and had experienced the same sequence of events, early loss, abandonment, foster care, attachment disruption, a clinician would predict very similar outcomes. The show explores this thread most directly in the later episodes of New Blood, where Harrison and Dexter attempt to build a relationship. And what emerges is simultaneously hopeful and devastating, because you can see in their interactions the possibility of connection. Dexter teaches Harrison. Harrison, despite his anger, wants to learn. There are moments of genuine father-son warmth that neither of them expected or knew how to handle. For a brief window, it seems like the cycle might break, like Dexter might be able to give Harrison what Harry never gave him, not a code, but actual understanding. Not management, but connection. And then it falls apart, because Dexter can't help Harrison without first addressing his own unresolved trauma. and Dexter has never addressed his own unresolved trauma, and the code provides no mechanism for doing so. The same framework that failed Dexter now fails Harrison, because the only tool Dexter has for relating to his son's darkness is the tool Harry gave him. Channel it, control it, accept that it's permanent. And Harrison, who came to Iron Lake looking for a father, instead finds another version of Harry, another man who sees darkness as destiny rather than damage. Harrison is angry. He has grown up without a father, believing that Dexter abandoned him, frightens the people around him, and he frightens the people around him, and he wants to understand why. He wants to know if what's wrong with him is what was wrong with his father. He wants to know if the darkness is hereditary. This is the question the show raises with Harrison, and it's the same question it raised with Dexter. Is it nature or nurture? Is Harrison's aggression genetic, passed down through Dexter's bloodline like a recessive gene waiting to activate? Or is it environmental, the predictable consequence of being raised in the aftermath of extreme violence, of sitting in his mother's blood before he could walk, of growing up in a series of unstable homes with no consistent attachment figure? The show leans toward biology again, the dark passenger as inheritance, the darkness as something in the blood passed from father to son, the way eye color or bone structure is passed. And this framing has a seductive simplicity to it. If Harrison's darkness is genetic, then it's not anyone's fault. It's just what the Morgan bloodline produces. It's fate. But the clinical reality is much more complicated and much sadder. Harrison doesn't need a genetic explanation for his violent impulses. He has a trauma explanation that is more than sufficient. He experienced a catastrophic loss before he was 2 years old. He then lost his father, who abandoned him. He was raised in the child welfare system, which is itself a source of additional trauma, particularly for children who have already experienced early attachment disruption. He was denied the stable, consistent caregiving that a child's developing brain requires in order to build the capacity for emotional regulation and impulse control. Every single risk factor for the development of conduct problems and callous unemotional traits in children is present in Harrison's history. Early parental loss, attachment disruption, unstable caregiving environments, exposure to violence, absence of a primary attachment figure during critical developmental windows. You don't need a dark passenger to explain Harrison. You need a developmental psychology textbook, and yet the show never makes this argument. New Blood treats Harrison's darkness as confirmation of Dexter's biological fatalism, like father, like son, born in blood, raised in blood, destined to bleed. It's the same framework Harry applied to Dexter, and it's just as wrong for the same reasons. The difference is that this time we can see the damage in real time because Harrison is young enough that intervention might still make a difference. He hasn't spent 3 decades building a kill ritual. He hasn't wrapped his identity around a code. The window is still open, which makes the New Blood finale the most psychologically devastating moment in the entire franchise. Harrison confronts Dexter. He has learned the full truth about what his father is. He has seen Dexter kill. He has witnessed the plastic-wrapped room and the ritual and the cold efficiency of a man dismembering another human being. And in the confrontation, something shifts in the dynamic between them. Harrison is no longer the child looking to his father for guidance. He becomes the judge, the one who sees clearly what Dexter cannot see about himself. And this is the terrible irony. Harrison, who has every reason to repeat his father's patterns, who grew up in the same aftermath of blood and abandonment, who carries the same potential for violence, is the one who says no. He looks at what Dexter is and refuses to accept it as inevitable. He refuses to accept the code. He refuses to accept the dark passenger. He refuses to believe that darkness is hereditary and permanent and unbeatable. In a sense, Harrison does what no one in Dexter's life has ever done. He challenges the foundational narrative. He says to his father's face that there is another way. But the way Harrison chooses to end the cycle is itself an act of violence. And that's the contradiction the show can't resolve. Harrison takes a rifle, he points it at his father, and Dexter, standing in the snow outside the cabin in Iron Lake, does something that reveals the full depth of Harry's influence on his psychology. He consents. Dexter tells Harrison to shoot him. He accepts death as the only way to break the cycle, the only way to protect his son from becoming what he became. And in that moment of consent, Dexter is not acting as a free man making a rational choice. He is acting as Harry's creation, fulfilling the narrative that Harry wrote for him 30 years ago. The narrative that says Dexter is a monster. Rule 1, don't get caught. Well, he got caught. Rule 1, don't get caught. Well, he got caught. And the only option the code provides for a caught monster is termination. Dexter doesn't choose death because he's suicidal in the traditional clinical sense. He chooses death because the code has no provision for redemption. It has no chapter on healing. It has no scenario in which the monster gets better. The only ending the code allows is containment or destruction. And since containment has failed, destruction is all that's left. A psychologist watching this scene would see the tragedy clearly. Dexter has internalized Harry's framework so completely that he cannot imagine an alternative. He cannot conceive of a future in which he gets help, does the work, addresses the trauma, and gradually builds a life that doesn't require either killing or dying. That future is clinically possible. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible, and Dexter can't see it because Harry never showed it to him. The code has no room for it. And so Dexter dies or appears to die, believing that he is doing the one good thing he can still do for his son. But here's the question a psychologist would ask, and it's the question the show refuses to engage with. Does killing your father break a cycle of violence, or does it perpetuate one? Harrison pulls the trigger. He kills a man, his father, the person he came to Iron Lake to find, to understand, to connect with. And now that person is dead by Harrison's hand, and Harrison has to live with that for the rest of his life. This is not breaking the cycle. This is completing it. The shipping container produced Dexter. Dexter's life produced the conditions that killed Rita. Rita's death traumatized Harrison. Harrison's trauma led him to Iron Lake. And Iron Lake ends with Harrison committing an act of violence against the person he loves most. The cycle hasn't broken, it's added another revolution, and with Dexter's subsequent resurrection, confirmed in the continuation of the franchise, even the finality of death is denied. Dexter survives the gunshot wound. He is resuscitated. The cycle continues. The question remains open, and Harrison is left to carry forward not just his original trauma, but the additional trauma of having killed his own father, believing he was doing the right thing, and then learning that it didn't even work. The intergenerational pattern is now 3 layers deep. Laura's murder created Dexter. Dexter's life created the conditions for Harrison's trauma. Harrison's actions have now added a new layer of violence and guilt that will shape whatever comes next. And at no point in this entire multi-generational chain has anyone at all, suggested that what these people need is not a code, not a rifle, not consent to die, but a therapist. If you're getting sleepy and this is carrying you along, that's perfect. Subscribe and stay comfortable. Because we're getting close to the end now, and we need to talk about why Dexter can never seem to change, even when he wants to. There is a pattern in Dexter's life that repeats itself with the regularity of a compulsion, because that's exactly what it is. He has a moment of insight. He recognizes, usually through the influence of someone he cares about, that his life is not working, that the killing is costing him more than it's giving him, that the people he loves are being destroyed by his secret, and he resolves to change. He tries to stop killing. He tries to be a better father. He tries to build a life that doesn't require plastic wrap and bone saws. And every time, without exception, he fails. The compulsion returns. The dark passenger reasserts itself. Someone dies. Something is destroyed. And Dexter retreats back into the identity that Harry gave him. The killer with the code. The monster who can be managed but never healed. The show treats these failures as evidence that Dexter's condition is permanent. Each relapse confirms the biological fatalism that the narrative depends on. See, the show says he tried to change and he couldn't. The darkness is too deep. The dark passenger is too strong. Harry was right. Vogel was right. Dexter is what he is. But a psychologist would see these failures very differently, and to understand why, we need to talk about something called secondary gain. Secondary gain is a concept from clinical psychology that describes the unconscious benefits a person derives from maintaining a symptom or a problematic pattern of behavior. The person genuinely wants to change. The desire for something different is real. But the existing pattern serves functions that the person may not be fully aware of, and letting go of the pattern means losing those functions before replacements have been established. For Dexter, the kill ritual serves multiple functions beyond the obvious one. It provides a sense of identity. Without the code, Dexter doesn't know who he is. It provides a sense of purpose. The code frames his existence as meaningful, as justice, as protection for the innocent. It provides emotional regulation. The ritual, as we've discussed, is a form of trauma reenactment that provides temporary relief from the unprocessed feelings locked in the shipping container, and it provides a relationship with his dead father. Every kill is an act of obedience to Harry. Every successful disposal is a confirmation that Harry's system works, that Harry was right, that Harry's presence in Dexter's life still matters. Take all of that away, and what is Dexter left with? A man with no identity, no purpose, no mechanism for emotional regulation, and no relationship with the father whose approval he has spent his entire life seeking. That's not just scary, that's psychologically annihilating. And the unconscious mind, which is always working to protect the person from experiences that threaten psychological survival, will fight against change that promises annihilation, even when the conscious mind desperately wants things to be different. This is why Dexter's attempts at change always fail. Not because change is impossible, but because the change he's attempting is unsupported. He is trying to remove a complex, multi-layered defense system through sheer willpower without putting anything in its place. It's like trying to demolish a building while you're still living in it. The structure is dangerous and damaged, and everyone can see it needs to come down. But if you don't have somewhere else to live, you're going to keep patching the walls and staying put, because the alternative is sleeping in the open with no protection at all. We see this play out most clearly in the gap between Season 8 and New Blood. After Deborah's death, Dexter fakes his own death, abandons Harrison, and moves to Iron Lake, New York, where he lives as Jim Lindsay for nearly 10 years. He does not kill during this period. He suppresses his urges through sheer force of will. And on the surface, this looks like change. It looks like Dexter has beaten the compulsion, but he hasn't. He's just white-knuckling it. He hasn't processed the underlying trauma. He hasn't addressed the dissociative patterns. He hasn't replaced the code with a healthier structure. He has simply added another layer of suppression on top of the layers that were already there. The Jim Lindsay identity is just another mask, and unlike the Dexter Morgan mask, this one doesn't even have a ritual to provide the illusion of mastery. Dexter in Iron Lake is a man holding his breath. He can hold it for a remarkably long time, years even. But he is still holding his breath, and eventually the body demands air. You can see the signs of strain if you know what to look for. He works at a shop selling sporting goods. He has a relationship with the local police chief, Angela Bishop, that is built on the same foundation of deception that characterized his relationship with Rita. He is performing normalcy in a new town with a new name, and the performance is just as hollow as it was in Miami because the same dissociative architecture is underneath it. The setting changed, the person didn't. And when Harrison arrives in Iron Lake, when the emotional pressure of reunion and fatherhood and the resurgence of attachment cracks the lid that Dexter has been holding down for a decade, the compulsion returns with full force. Because it was never gone, it was just waiting. stored in the same place it has always been, in the body of a 3-year-old boy who was never allowed to process what happened to him. Dexter's inability to change is not evidence that his condition is untreatable. It's evidence that he has never received actual treatment. There is an enormous difference between trying to change through willpower alone and changing through structured therapeutic intervention. Willpower without clinical support is almost never sufficient for deeply entrenched psychological patterns. People with substance addictions know this. People with eating disorders know this. People with chronic depression or anxiety or PTSD know this. The pattern doesn't yield to effort alone. It yields to effort combined with professional guidance, appropriate tools, and a sustained therapeutic relationship that provides what the person was never given. Dexter has never had any of that. The closest thing he has had to a therapist is Dr. Evelyn Vogel. And Vogel was not treating Dexter, she was studying him. She was validating her own theoretical framework through his existence. Emotional growth. Vogel didn't encourage emotional growth, Vogel didn't encourage it. She redirected him back to the framework, back to the kill room, back to the identity that her career depended on. A real therapist, a competent one, would have done the exact opposite. A real therapist would have recognized those moments of emotional growth. The grief after Rita's death, the guilt about Deborah's spiral, the increasing reluctance to kill, as evidence that Dexter's dissociative barriers were weakening, that the emotions sealed away in the shipping container were beginning to surface. And a real therapist would have helped Dexter sit with those emotions, process them, integrate them into his identity, rather than sealing them back up behind the mask. But Dexter never gets that therapist. The show's narrative structure won't allow it, because a Dexter who gets effective therapy is a Dexter who stops killing, and a Dexter who stops killing is a show that loses its premise. So instead, Dexter cycles through the same pattern again and again. Insight, attempt at change, failure, relapse, retreat. The cycle repeats not because the condition is permanent, but because the intervention is never applied. There is a devastating irony in the season 8 episode titled Scar Tissue, where Vogel takes Deborah back to a shipping container as part of her therapy for PTSD. The container, the literal site of Dexter's origin trauma, and the symbolic site of Deborah's moral injury. Vogel brings Deborah to this place and asks her to relive the night she killed Lagerta. She asks Deborah to confront the experience directly, to process it, to break free from the loop of avoidance and repression. And the technique itself, exposure therapy, is clinically sound. Guided re-experiencing of traumatic memories in a safe environment is one of the most evidence-based treatments for PTSD. The problem is that Vogel isn't providing a safe environment. She is a therapist with a fundamental conflict of interest, a woman whose primary loyalty is not to Deborah's recovery, but to the preservation of Dexter's identity and, by extension, her own professional legacy. When Deborah blurts out during the session that she had a memory or a fantasy of shooting Dexter instead of Lagerta, Vogel doesn't explore this clinically significant disclosure with the neutrality it demands. She redirects, she reassures. She tells Deborah that she had no choice but to shoot Lagerta, which is not therapeutic honesty, it's narrative control. Vogel is managing Deborah's trauma to protect Dexter's cover, not to heal Deborah's wound. The therapy fails not because the technique is wrong, but because the therapist is compromised. And this is the central tragedy of every failed therapeutic opportunity in the entire franchise. Not that therapy wouldn't work, but that no one in Dexter's life has ever provided genuine, uncompromised therapeutic care. Harry wasn't a therapist. He was a frightened father playing one. Vogel wasn't a therapist, at least not for Dexter. She was a scientist with a pet project. And the show itself won't allow a real therapist to enter the story because a real therapist would challenge the show's foundational premise. And the premise is what keeps the narrative running. Consider what a competent, uncompromised therapist would actually do with Dexter. First, they would establish safety, not the illusion of safety that the code provides, where Dexter feels safe because he's following rules, but genuine psychological safety. A relationship in which Dexter could, for the first time in his life, be fully known without being rejected or managed. This alone would be unlike anything Dexter has ever experienced because he has never been seen by another human being without the mask between them. Then the therapist would begin, slowly and carefully, to challenge the narrative. Not by telling Dexter he's wrong about himself, which would only trigger defenses, but by asking questions, by sitting with him in the moments when emotion breaks through the dissociative barrier and saying, "You felt something just now. What was that?" By helping him notice that the hollow place inside fills up sometimes in moments of connection with Deborah, in moments of tenderness with Harrison, in moments of grief and guilt that a truly empty person would never experience. The therapist would help Dexter build a new narrative, not to replace Harry's narrative, but to exist alongside it, so that Dexter could begin to consider the possibility that Harry was wrong. That the hollow place isn't hollow, that the mask isn't covering nothing, that the 3-year-old boy in the container didn't lose his capacity for feeling. He just forgot where he put it. Would this work? Would years of careful, trauma-focused therapy actually change the trajectory of a man who has spent 3 decades killing people? The honest clinical answer is possibly, not certainly, not easily. The severity of Dexter's trauma, the depth of his conditioning, the number of people he has killed, and the psychological weight of carrying that history, all of these would make treatment extraordinarily challenging. There would be setbacks. There would be moments where the old patterns reasserted themselves. There would be times when Dexter, faced with the full weight of his actions, would want to retreat back into the familiar comfort of the mask and the code. But the possibility would exist. And in psychology, possibility is not nothing. Possibility is everything. And then there's Harry's ghost. Harry's ghost is, psychologically speaking, the most important character in the series after Dexter himself. Harry is dead. He died by suicide after seeing what the code produced. But Dexter continues to see him, talk to him, argue with him throughout the entire run of the show. Harry appears in Dexter's apartment, in his car, in the kill room, in moments of crisis and moments of calm. He offers advice, he reinforces the code, he validates Dexter's identity. He is, in every meaningful sense, still Dexter's father, still shaping Dexter's decisions, still writing the narrative of Dexter's life. A psychologist would recognize Harry's ghost as an internalized critical voice. This is a common phenomenon in people who have experienced authoritarian or controlling parenting. The parent's voice becomes incorporated into the person's own psychology, and it continues to operate long after the parent is gone. The person hears the parent's judgments, the parent's rules, the parent's assessment of who they are. And because the voice comes from inside their own head, they mistake it for their own thoughts. They don't realize they're still being parented by a dead man. Harry's ghost tells Dexter that the dark passenger is real. Harry's ghost tells Dexter that the code is necessary. Harry's ghost tells Dexter again and again that he is what Harry said he was, and that there is no alternative. And Dexter, who has never had a competing voice, a therapist's voice, a voice that says something different, accepts Harry's assessment as truth. This is why Dexter can't change. It's not because his condition is permanent, it's because the voice that defines his condition is permanent. Harry is always there, in Dexter's mind, in his decision-making, in his self-understanding. And Harry's voice says change is impossible. So Dexter believes change is impossible. And so change doesn't happen. The therapeutic task, if Dexter ever received actual therapy, would be to help him separate Harry's voice from his own. To help him recognize that the identity Harry built for him is not the only identity available. That the mask and the code and the dark passenger are not permanent features of his psychology, but defense mechanisms that were installed by a frightened man with no clinical training, and that defense mechanism can be replaced with healthier structures once the underlying need they serve is addressed. But this would require Dexter to do something genuinely terrifying. It would require him to let go of the identity that has organized his entire life. The identity of the monster, the identity of the controlled killer, the identity that, however damaged and destructive, gives him a sense of self, a sense of purpose, a sense of knowing who he is and what he's for. Without the code, without the mask, without the dark passenger, Dexter would be a man with no identity at all. He would be the 3-year-old in the container without the walls Harry built around that child. And that is the thing Dexter fears more than death. Not the container itself, but the container without the code. The trauma without the framework, the pain without the management system. It's the same reason people stay in destructive relationships, in toxic jobs, in patterns of behavior that they know are killing them. The known suffering, however terrible, is less frightening than the unknown that lies on the other side of change. And for Dexter, the known suffering is the code. It's murder. It's isolation. It's the mask. It's terrible, but it's his. And letting it go would mean becoming someone he has never been and is not sure he can be. A psychologist would understand this resistance. They would be patient with it. They would work slowly, building trust, challenging the narrative piece by piece, helping Dexter discover that the emotions Harry said he didn't have are actually there, waiting, still alive behind the dissociative barrier. It would be the work of years, not sessions. It would be painful and uncertain, and there would be setbacks. But the clinical basis for hope would exist, because Dexter's condition, if it's trauma-based rather than constitutional, is responsive to treatment. The door Harry locked can be reopened. The question is whether anyone will ever give Dexter the key. If this has been a journey, and I know it has, stay with me for just a little longer. Subscribe and settle in one last time, because we need to arrive at the final question, the one that matters most. Could Dexter Morgan have been saved? Here is what a psychologist would conclude about Dexter Morgan if they could see the entire picture. If they had access to every episode, every internal monologue, every ghost of Harry, and every blood slide, and every moment where the mask slipped, and the real Dexter, the wounded one, the feeling one, looked out from behind those dead, careful eyes. They would conclude that Dexter Morgan is not a psychopath. Not in the classical, constitutional sense. Not in the way the show tells us he is, the way Harry told him he was, the way Vogel validated, and the way Dexter himself believes. He is a severely traumatized individual whose emotional capacity was dissociated, not destroyed, by witnessing his mother's chainsaw murder at the age of 3 while sitting in her blood for 2 days in a shipping container. His subsequent psychological development was shaped not by biology, but by a catastrophic intervention that taught him he was a monster, rather than helping him heal from what made him monstrous. They would note in their clinical report the repeated evidence of genuine emotional capacity, the grief after Rita, the bond with Deborah, the protectiveness toward Harrison, the guilt that deepened over time rather than diminishing. The self-questioning, the doubt, would note that these are not the markers. Would note that these are not the markers of a man without feelings. They are the markers of a man with so many feelings that his entire life has been organized around the task of keeping them contained. They would note the trajectory, the way Dexter's antisocial behavior moderated over time, the way his emotional connections deepened and became harder to dismiss, the way his interest in killing waned even as the compulsion continued. They would recognize this trajectory as consistent with secondary psychopathy, the kind that develops from environmental factors, the kind that responds to the natural moderating effects of age and experience, the kind that is, in principle, responsive to therapeutic intervention, not the kind you're born with, the kind that is done to you. And they would note, with professional detachment that might not quite conceal the sadness underneath, that the tragedy of Dexter Morgan is not the tragedy of a born predator who never had a chance. That would be simpler, that would be clean. You could file it away under, some people are just evil, and move on to the next patient. The tragedy is that he had a chance, and it was taken from him. Not by the drug dealers who killed his mother, not by the shipping container, not by the blood. Those things happened, and they were terrible, but they were the wound. The wound alone doesn't determine the outcome. What determines the outcome is what happens after the wound. And what happened after Dexter's wound was Harry. Harry Morgan loved Dexter. That has to be acknowledged because it matters. Harry didn't create the code out of cruelty or indifference. Knew how to do. He was a cop. He knew how to do. He was a cop. He understood criminals. He understood management and containment and behavioral control. Those were the tools he had, and he used them. But love is not the same as competence, and good intentions are not the same as good outcomes. Harry's love was filtered through ignorance, through fear, through a law enforcement understanding of criminal psychology rather than a clinical understanding of childhood trauma. He looked at a traumatized child and saw a dangerous predator. He looked at dissociative symptoms and saw a psychopathic effect. He looked at trauma reenactment and saw innate violent urges. And every conclusion he drew was wrong, not because he was stupid, but because he was looking through the wrong lens. If Harry had looked through a different lens, if he had taken Dexter to a child psychologist who specialized in developmental trauma, if that psychologist had recognized the dissociative patterns, the attachment disruption, the sensory imprints from the container, if Dexter had received EMDR, or trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or attachment-based intervention at an age when the brain was still plastic enough to respond to treatment, if any of that had happened, would the boy who sat in his mother's blood have become the man who collects blood on glass slides? The research says possibly. Studies on children exposed to severe early trauma, including violence, neglect, and betrayal by attachment figures, have shown that early therapeutic intervention can produce lasting changes in emotional regulation, impulse control, and the capacity for empathy. The traits Dexter developed, the emotional numbing, the compulsive behavior, the dissociative patterns, are adaptive responses. And adaptive responses can be modified when the environment changes and the right support is provided. Not always, not in every case. The severity of Dexter's trauma was extreme, and not every child responds to intervention, regardless of how early or how skillful. But the possibility existed. From the very beginning, the possibility existed that Dexter Morgan could have been different, and nobody tried. Harry didn't try because he believed the condition was innate. Vogel didn't try because her career was built on the assumption that psychopathy was permanent. The show didn't try because a Dexter in therapy doesn't generate 8 seasons of television. And Dexter himself didn't try because every voice in his life, external and internal, living and dead, told him there was nothing to try for, that he was born in blood, and born in blood he would remain. And maybe that's the cruelest part of the whole story. Not the shipping container, not Laura Moser's murder, not the chainsaw, or the blood, or the 2-day wait. The cruelest part is the silence afterward, the absence of the one conversation that could have changed everything. The conversation where someone sat down with a small boy who was drowning in his own dissociation and said, "Tell me what happened. Tell me what you saw. Tell me what you feel." Because whatever you feel is okay. Whatever is happening inside you right now is a normal response to something that should never have happened. And we're going to work through it together. That conversation never happened. Instead, Harry's conversation happened. "You're different, Dexter. You have urges that other people don't have, and we're going to learn how to control them." The first conversation would have opened a door. The second conversation sealed it shut. And Dexter has been standing on the wrong side of that door for 30 years. There is a moment in the pilot episode that most viewers pass over without giving it much thought. Dexter is driving through Miami at night, and he says in voiceover, "How is it I can kill people and feel no regret? But disappointing Rita makes me feel like the scum of the earth." He says it as though it's a paradox, as though the two halves of the sentence don't fit together. How can a man who feels nothing about murder feel something about disappointment? But there is no paradox. The sentence answers its own question. Dexter feels things about Rita because he loves her, and he feels nothing about the killing because the killing happens inside the dissociative bubble, the walled-off space where emotions are not permitted because letting them in would mean feeling the full weight of what he's done, which would mean feeling the full weight of what was done to him, which would mean going back to the container. The emotional numbness around the killing isn't proof that Dexter lacks feelings. It's proof that certain feelings are locked behind a door he's terrified to open. But the feelings about Rita, about Deborah, about Harrison, those feelings are on his side of the door. They leak through. They always leak through. And every time they do, they prove that Harry was wrong. The show's answer is biological fatalism. You are what you are. The dark passenger is real and permanent, and the best you can do is steer it. Born in blood. End of story. The clinical answer is different. The clinical answer is that Dexter was born in trauma, and trauma, unlike biology, can sometimes be healed. The dissociative barriers can come down. The emotions locked away in the shipping container can be accessed, processed, integrated. The compulsive reenactment can be replaced with genuine emotional expression. The mask can come off, not to reveal a void, but to reveal a person who has been there all along, waiting to be seen. And maybe that's the thing that would keep a psychologist up at night after they closed Dexter's file and turned off the lights. Not the horror of what Dexter did, not the body count or the plastic wrap or the blood slides stored in the air conditioning unit. Those things are terrible, but they're comprehensible. They fit into categories. They can be understood within existing frameworks of violence and psychopathology and criminal behavior. What would keep the psychologist up at night is simpler than all of that. It's the image of a 3-year-old boy in a shipping container. A boy who hadn't done anything wrong. A boy whose mother loved him and whose brain was developing normally and whose life, up until the moment Santos Jimenez started that chainsaw, contained every possibility that any other 3-year-old's life contains. Happiness, connection, the chance to grow up and feel things and build a life and be known by another person and know them in return. All of that possibility was still there when Harry opened the container door. Damaged, yes. Deeply, severely damaged, but not destroyed. The research is clear on this. At age 3, after 2 days of unimaginable trauma, the possibility of recovery still existed. The brain was still plastic enough. The attachment system, while disrupted, was still forming. The dissociative barriers, while already in place, were not yet permanent. Harry picked the boy up. Harry took him home. Harry loved him as much as he knew how to love him. And then Harry told him the one thing that would ensure the possibility stayed forever unrealized. He told him he was a monster. He told him the darkness was permanent. He told him there was nothing inside but a hollow place and a hunger that could only be managed, never healed. And the boy believed him, because he was 3 years old, and then he was 4, and then he was 10, and then he was 20. And by then, the narrative was so deeply embedded in his sense of self that he couldn't tell where Harry's voice ended and his own began. The possibility was still there, buried under decades of conditioning and ritual and blood. But Dexter couldn't see it, and no one else could see it either, because everyone who looked at him saw what Harry saw: a monster, a dark passenger, a man born in blood. Dexter Morgan is not a god of death, masquerading as a blood spatter analyst. He is not a dark passenger wearing human skin. He is not a born predator who learned to mimic love while feeling nothing. Dexter Morgan is a 3-year-old boy sitting in his mother's blood. He has been sitting there for 30 years. He is still waiting for someone to open the container, to pick him up, to tell him that what happened was not his fault, and that whatever is wrong with him can be helped. Harry opened the container, and Harry told him he was a monster. And that became the truth, not because it was true, but because no one ever told him otherwise. That's what a psychologist would say about Dexter Morgan. He was never the monster. He was always the child. And the saddest part